Imagine yourself aboard a warship in the year 1718. You are on the hunt for pirates, and you find one of their vessels plundering an innocent merchant ship. As you hoist your colors and bear down on them, the pirates make sail and pull off, setting fire to the merchant. You want revenge. You chase them. Suddenly, the wind dies. Both ships come to a standstill. Musketeers deployed in the tops and forecastle take potshots at the pirates, and the bow guns open fire. Suddenly, you see small ports opening up in the sides of the pirate. They're running out the oars. Quickly, your captain orders you and your boys to get in the rowboats. You attach a line between the boats and the ship, allowing you to tow the ship behind you. Slowly but surely, the pursuit continues. The pirates are faster. You have to catch them. You slave away on the oars in your rowboat. Suddenly, you hear a sort of creak. The ropes behind you strain, and you grind to a halt. The ship has run aground. The pirate ship, being much lighter, was able to pass safely over the shallows. With the plunder in their hold and the oars out of their scuttles, the pirates escape. Oars are a forgotten aspect of naval warfare. They weren't only relegated to rowboats or the Mediterranean galley. This was a type of sailing craft, primarily propelled by oars. During the 16th century, they utterly dominated naval warfare in Europe. It was easy to install heavy artillery on board a galley compared to the medieval sailship. Owing to their galley fleets, the Spaniards and Turks were able to carve out sizable empires in the Mediterranean basin. However, the Mediterranean galley had its drawbacks. Whilst rowing allowed them to move at a stable speed in any weather, they were slow compared to sail ships. Neither could you row for more than a few hours at a time, lest you'd exhaust your crew. In order to properly man all the oars, they needed large crews who needed living quarters and provisions. A galley could only travel 3 days before needing to resupply. They were dependent on a supply network of bases and couldn't undertake oceanic voyages of trade or exploration. Neither could they handle heavy seas or hard weather. They were only a local implement for transporting troops, delivering messages, and patrolling. By the mid-1500s, the sailship was superior in every regard, and even the Barbary corsairs, famous for their slave galleys, now preferred to use sailships. But rowing itself would remain a vital component of naval warfare well into the industrial era, when it was finally supplanted by steam engines. Sadly, the importance of rowing in naval and especially pirate tactics has been forgotten by historians, authors, video games, and movies. Except for Curse of the Black Pearl. That movie is strangely accurate. Is this a teaser? Anyway, oars could be found on pretty much every ship in the American colonies. Having the ability to move in calm winds was just so damn useful. It allowed pirates to pursue their targets and for their targets to escape, regardless of the wind. If the rigging was damaged by gunfire, the ship could retreat by rowing. This is why even rated warships in the Navy were built to carry oars, even in the age of Nelson and Napoleon. The oars mounted aboard a sailship were known as sweeps. This is why Barbossa calls out "run out the sweeps" in Curse of the Black Pearl. They were large and heavy things, 5 to 6 meters long, and needed 3 men to heave. The sweeps were stuck out of special oar ports, called scuttles. On some ships, these scuttles were opened from above, the same as gun ports. For the most part, they were opened and closed from the sides. They were opened simply by slamming them open, and then closed from the inside with a rope attached to a ring bolt. When the sweeps weren't in use, they were either stored outside of the ship, kept along the sides on the channels, which are rigging platforms on the outside of the ship. They could also be racked on gallows amidships, and on larger vessels, the carlings. These are horizontal beams running along the length of the ship. It was only practical to cut oar ports in a ship with fine lines, meaning she was straight. Warships had finer lines, whereas most merchants had rounder shapes. Finer lines made it easier to aim a broadside, and rounder shapes allowed you to carry more cargo. Three-masted ships built for speed were called frigate-built. These were especially good for rowing. And when pirates captured a new ship, they would often cut their own scuttles into her sides. Since pirate ships were usually overcrowded, finding men to man the sweeps was not an issue for them, and provided much needed tactical flexibility. How many oars could a ship carry? It depended. Since the oars and the oarsmen shared the same working space as cannons and gun crews, the captain would have to make a decision whether he wanted more oars, more speed, more cannons, more firepower, or somehow strike a balance. Let's take a look at several alternatives. This contemporary ship plan of the HMS Bonetta, a sloop of war with 4 guns, shows her having 12 oars on one side, so 24 in total. Being a European sloop and not a colonial, she was rigged with 3 masts instead of 1. She was used for treasure hunting, pirate hunting, and command of her was at one point offered to Bartholomew Sharp, the notorious buccaneer. This sort of vessel would have been a favorite among pirates and pirate hunters. They simply didn't need so many cannons. It was better to have speed and tactical flexibility. This ship model depicts a brig from 1696. She has 10 oarports on each side, and interestingly, her battery is relegated to the back of the ship. This allows the gun crews and rowers to work their respective stations without disturbing the other. It's kinda messy to reload a cannon when you have some guy pulling an oar just next to you. This model is very indicative of what pirate ships of this size, and also what smaller, armed merchants would have looked like. Let's look at some slightly larger vessels. This French illustration shows an armed merchant ship, kitted out with 20 guns and 22 oars. They clearly wanted to strike a balance, so they fitted the sculls between the gun ports. This would have been very common on smaller pirate ships as well, those weighing something between like 100 to 250 tons burthen. Fitting sculls between gun ports was also done on larger ships. This 4th-rate galley frigate called Tiger, built in 1681, carried 18 sweeps on each side, with 2 sculls placed between each gun port. Obviously, she is much heavier than my previous examples. She was definitely heavier than any pirate ship. But I want to show her as an example that you could have decks partially armed with cannons and sweeps, and more than a single oarport between the guns. But some pirates did have ships that were at least heavier than 250 tons burthen, around 300 to 400. These were large enough to have a lower deck dedicated entirely for rowing. Known as the oar deck, or lower gun deck, it had to be sufficiently tall, so that the oarsmen could stand upright, not hunch like shrimps, and put their full force into each thrust. Rather than being seated on a bench, as was typical on Mediterranean galleys, rowing on a sailship was done standing upright. The ship's boatswain timed the oar strokes with a yo-ho, and some crafty commanders had the oars connected with a line, so that the crew could pull in unison. Spare crew could also pull at the line itself. Good effort on the oars allowed the ship to gain a speed of between 2 to 3 knots. You could only row for an hour before the crew would get exhausted. Neither could you row a ship in heavy seas, or if the ship was heeling significantly, swaying side to side. Neither was it possible to row a heavy ship against the wind, something which was possible with piraguas, canoes, and half-galleys, a type of vessel which we'll discuss at the end of the video. Rowing and sailing was seldom done at the same time, though there are a few free cases. For the most part, sails were used when you had wind, and sweeps when there was no wind. An alternative to using sweeps was towing the ship behind several rowboats. This is seen in the movie Master and Commander. I don't know how fast this was, but was likely slower and more cumbersome. However, you wouldn't have to keep sweeps aboard or cut oarports into the sides. With a large enough crew, you could even row and tow the ship at the same time. Full-rigged ships built to be optimized for rowing were termed galley ships. The best of them were frigate-built and termed galley frigates. These include famous pirate vessels like the Adventure and Whydah. But how many sweeps could they carry? I don't know of any historical depictions of galley frigates used by pirates, but we do have a few which would have been similar at least. This ship model depicts a 20-gun frigate from 1719, carrying a total of 36 oars, 18 on each side. She would have been similar to the famous Whydah, Sam Bellamy's ship. The 32-gun Charles, built in 1676, carried a total of 40 oars, 20 on each side. She would have been similar to the Adventure, Captain Kidd's ship. Owing to their speed and reliability, galley ships were popular among privateers, pirates, and slave traders. The slaves had to be delivered quickly, before they perished. Galley ships became popular with merchants in the Anglo-French Wars. Traders could quickly cross between England and Ireland and use the oars to evade French corsairs. But interest in rowing waxed and waned throughout the period. The disadvantage of sweeps was that they were heavy and cumbersome. So in peacetime, there was a strong incentive to leave them behind, and for a while, dockyards grew out of the habit of cutting holes for them. This happened on and off throughout the 18th century, with interest dying off and reviving between peace and wartime. Interest rose especially in wars that were fought in estuaries and coastal waters, like the War of Spanish Succession and American Revolution. You might have noticed that the Caribbean is strikingly similar to the Mediterranean. It has lots of shallow waters and coastlines full of fresh provisions. This makes it well suited for the galley warfare of the Mediterranean. The Spanish fought the same. Indeed, had the Atlantic never existed and Spain had just continued into the Americas, they could just have used their old galley fleet to conquer the West Indies. But galleys weren't seaworthy enough to survive the Atlantic crossing. Instead, the old models had to be rebuilt in the colonies. Their design of choice was the galeota. To foreigners, it was often called galley, half galley, or Spanish piragua. Thanks to shipbuilding schematics from Havana, we know exactly what they looked like, to a T. The design has even been corroborated by eyewitness illustrations. This one shows a galeota captured by the French filibuster, Nicolas Brigon. This picture shows the half galley interpreted by a European artist. It's a bit off-key. Finally, this picture shows a Mediterranean galleot, virtually identical to the Caribbean half galley. They were 27 meters long, 5 meters wide, 1.5 meters deep, and carried between 36 to 44 oars. Their crew counted anything between 80 to 120 men. Rowing was sometimes relegated to prisoners, but was primarily done by the Spanish crew, which likewise served as combatants. They sat down on benches when rowing, 1 man per oar, but more men could have helped out when necessary. The oversized crew could also have rotated between rowing and relaxing to prevent exhaustion. Powered only by oars, they could reach speeds of 4 to 5 knots, meaning they were faster than oared ships. The captain could position himself on this raised little quarterdeck. They had 2 masts rigged with either lateen or square sails, and the masts could be dropped to reduce wind resistance, or if you wanted to be stealthy, wanted a low profile. A naval flag or ensign was flown from the staff at the quarterdeck, and pennants from the mast tops. Compared to the piraguas more popular with their Protestant opponents, the half galley commanded considerable firepower. 4 swivel guns, and 1 or 2 cannons mounted into 4. This was great for chasing and coastal bombardment, but firing the gun would also have slowed them down during chases. Spain's interconnected colonies made for a perfect supply network for galley fleets, and the half galleys were primarily used for coastal protection and pirate hunting. After Henry Morgan destroyed the Spanish pirate hunting fleet in 1669, the guardacosta became Spain's main mode of colonial defense. It was cheap for local governors to build half galleys and hire the men to crew them. They were usually foreigners and minorities with little to no opportunities in the colonies, and they were far from gentle in their tactics. They would pull the half galleys ashore and camouflage them. When a ship was spotted, the galleys were launched into the sea like arrows against their prey. Captured ships were used as bait. They did not distinguish between pirates, smugglers, and merchants. Victims were often mistreated, and few lived to tell the tale. Since the French and English lacked the same supply network as the Spanish, their pirates did not favor the half galley. Their ships needed to operate more independently and stay out at sea for longer periods without the need to resupply. But a few half galleys did end up in the possession of French filibusters. In the 1680s, 2 or 3 were active in Saint-Domingue. They formed a part of larger buccaneer fleets, in which they were used for performing reconnaissance, securing provisions, cutting off enemy messengers, and capturing local guides. It was auxiliary, and a phenomenon unique to the Caribbean. More popular with the French and English were launches, double shallops, the canoe, and its big bad cousin, the piragua. These could be used very effectively, and if you wish to learn more, I have an entire video dedicated to them. If you want to learn more about the advent of the Mediterranean galley, please check out my secondary channel, Baltic Empire, which has a 25-minute documentary on the topic. One of the greatest pirate galleys ever built was the Adventure. Unlike other pirate ships, she was purpose-built for that purpose, and might have seemed like the best rover ship ever. Yet, this legendary vessel sank. In the coming months, I will explore her in her own video. But first, we'll have to deal with her captain. Huge thanks to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Cole Freer, Max Twick, 1660, Michaela Jans, Daniel Stryker, Sea-Dog, and Randall DeVere. If you'd like to interact with me or fellow pirate enthusiasts, please check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers.